Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to give everyone a moment to connect. We're so glad you're here for our program today at Uihlein, and I do have a map up, and if you want to orientate yourself as to where you are compared to where this virtual field trip is taking place today, you'll see that big red star in Essex County, and we are in Lake Placid today. So in the North Country, in the Adirondack Park, we're at the Cornell Maple Research Forest, and we are going to meet our friend Adam Wild today, who's the director of that program. So as we get connected, figure out where you are and where this program is taking place. Just a few reminders. Also, you'll be able to ask questions during this session. If you've already thought of some questions that you want to start putting in the Q&A, you'll be able to find that at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to submit your questions. We'll be getting to those throughout the program. You'll have a live chance to ask those. So start loading those in now. You can also like other people's questions. If you also want that question, instead of typing it out yourself, you can give it the thumbs up in the Q&A box. We do have a question that's about the session being recorded. It is going to be recorded. And we'll send that in our follow-up, a link to a YouTube where you'll be able to access this. So, Mr. Best, I think we're just about ready. We have our attendees from not only New York State, but across the country joining us. So whenever you're ready, we'll let you take it away.
Good morning and welcome from the star on the map. I am at Lake Placid. My name is Jeremiah Best, and I'm with New York Agriculture in the Classroom, and I want to say a big hello to all the schools across the country. I saw we had schools from California, Georgia, from Liberty Online, and so welcome to New York. It's a beautiful state, and we're in the middle of the Maple Belt. And here for New York Agriculture in the Classroom, our mission is to help educate students and parents and communities about the Food and Fiber Network. And maple syrup is definitely a food. So we're here at Uihlein Forest with Mr. Adam Wild, and I have to say, Mr. Wild, for a maple researcher, you have the most awesome name to be out in the woods, in the wild, tapping. So tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about what this place is. Is it a production facility? Is it a research facility? Is it your own private facility? Tell us who you are and a little bit about it.
Hi there, welcome everybody to Cornell University's Uihlein Maple Research Forest. So this is property that's owned by Cornell University. We have about 350 acres here where we have a production maple facility, but we also are doing a lot of research that's going to help the maple industry through the different research that we're doing through our production facility that we have here. So I get to do a lot of the tapping of the trees and maple syrup production, just like any other maple producer would be doing. And I get to see some of the issues that they are encountering because I'm dealing with those issues too. And then I get to try different things to solve those issues and find ways that we can increase production, ways that we can be sustainable out in our woods out here. So we have healthy growing trees that we continue to get maple sap from year after year. And so we get to do and play with all these different things right out here in the woods. And then I get to share that with maple producers. So all the different research that I do, I get to work with maple producers and tell them the different things that I've found, things that'll help them in their production. So we'll talk a little bit about the research today as we go out, but we're going to also get to experience the process of going from our tree, collecting that sap and turning it into syrup in the bottle for us. So we're out here in this beautiful section of the woods. We should have about 6,500 maple trees that we'll be tapping this year and collecting sap from. And we're almost done tapping all of our trees. We still have about 800 more to go, so we're getting closer. We're getting ready for when that sap flow is going to start flowing pretty soon. We'll talk about that. And today we're gonna show you. We're actually going to tap a tree together. I'll show you how we actually do that. So as we start at the individual tree, this is where it's all gonna be happening. So we're getting maple sap from the tree, not maple syrup. The big difference is the amount of sugar and the consistency or the viscosity of that. The maple sap that I get from the tree looks a lot like water. So if I gave you a glass of water and a glass of maple sap, you couldn't tell me the difference by just looking at it. It's not thick and sticky like a lot of people think of when they think of sap. They're usually thinking of something different. That's actually the pitch that comes from like pine trees. That's really sticky, that gets on like picnic tables. So this is different. It's water. It's really kind of runny. It's going to flow very easily as we collect it. It only has about 2% sugar in the sap, so it's a really low percentage. The remainder of that is water. So 98% of that sap is water, plus some other minerals. There's natural electrolytes and antioxidants in the sap, but it's mostly water, so it flows really well through our tubing system that we use here. So the old traditional method of collecting maple sap was letting it flow into old buckets, and then you got to go out and collect all those buckets. The issue with that is it takes a lot of work. If you can imagine walking to 6,000 plus trees and taking a bucket, hauling it to a tank somewhere and dumping it, that's a lot of work. Also, doing that when sap is flowing, we're in the springtime when the snow is melting and the ground gets really soft because of water that's melting off from the snow. And so if you drive equipment through there, you're going to create ruts, and that destroys the soil and causes soil erosion and can harm the trees because you're digging down through the soil and you're disrupting the roots of the trees. So we use this tubing system that allows all this sap. It saves us labor, it increases production, but it also prevents us from disturbing the soil in our forests. So we can create these beautiful, natural, healthy forests that continue to thrive year after year. So if we look at our tree, when we start chapping a tree, it's usually going to be at least 40 years old before we actually start tapping it. We want it to be about 10 inches in diameter before we actually tap it. So this tree is probably about 14 inches in diameter. It's been tapped for the last couple of years. So we can certainly tap this. When we come to a tree, when we're looking to tap it, we're always going to look up and make sure that it has a nice, healthy canopy. There's lots of branches on it, so it's healthy and thriving. We don't want to tap trees that are not healthy. We want to tap healthy, thriving trees. So let's back up and think about the actual sap flow process of how we're able to collect the sap from the tree. Now today, as you can maybe see in the background, it's actually snowing right now, so it's a little bit colder. So we don't have sap flowing because what we need to have is temperatures that get above freezing. So we're kind of the end of winter when the snow is thawing, as I mentioned before, is when sap is flowing, because what happens is the trees have all these little gas particles inside them, like little tiny balloons. And when the weather's really cold, those little gas particles, a little balloon will actually shrink down and it creates more space. There's more volume in the wood that sap or water can actually be pulled in from the ground through the roots and travel up into the tree because there's all that extra room. But when it gets warm, it'll actually, those balloons, those little gas particles expand, and that creates less room and there's pressure inside of there, and it wants to push that sap out and it pushes it down. And when we have a tap hole into our tree, it's going to push that sap out into either our bucket or through our tubing system that we have connected to our individual trees. So we're not collecting any sap today because it's too cold. And so that's going to be happening in probably a couple weeks. It'll start to thaw out. It's going to be warmer in a couple days, and we will have some sap starting to flow a little bit. So it's usually in this region, it's not until kind of March that we get sap really flowing. So we're spending this time of the year making sure our lines are all up and ready to go, and we're tapping all of those trees. So each year,
Mr. Wild, sorry to interrupt you, but we do have a question. They want to know, what is the temperature there today, and what are our ideal temperatures going to be?
Yep, that's a great question. So today it's probably about 25 degrees out here today. So that's actually a little bit warmer of a day for up here in Lake Placid, where in the wintertime Oftentimes the temperatures at the high point maybe get to around 10 to 15 degrees. So it's about 25. It's a little bit warmer because we're getting into March. So the sap season is right around the corner. Yesterday, we did have temperatures that were above 35. So we need temperatures to go above freezing. And so freezing being 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So we need temperatures above that for sap to flow. And usually it can't be just above it. The best ideal conditions is around 40 degrees. Anywhere between 40 to 50 degrees in the day is the best. And then we actually want it to freeze up at night. And that's going to recharge the trees by bringing more water from the ground up into the trees. So anytime we get around 40 degrees, sap will get full. And because it's been, we haven't really had any thaws except for yesterday. So we had that little bit where it got up to like 35. And it was above freezing, but it wasn't enough because these trees have been cold all winter. We haven't had any thaws for a couple of months. And so it's been really cold. We have a lot of snow out here in the ground right now. So it takes a few days of it getting above freezing for it to really start to actually thaw out and for the trees to start flowing. So great question. All right, so let's look at actually tapping this tree. So each year we need to put a brand new spout because what happens if we look here, there's actually a couple old tap holes from the last 2 years. This was our tap hole last year with the yellow paint. So each year when we pull the spout at the end of the season, we put some paint out so we know where it was tapped the year, and we do different colors so we can monitor them. And then if we shift down, here's green was from the year before, so it's 2019. We can see that's pretty much sealed up. There's no open hole. So as the tree is growing, putting on growth rings, getting wider, it's going to seal over those holes. Whereas the one from last year is almost all the way closed. There's just a little tiny opening up there. So, but the tree creates a wound, just like if we get a cut in our body, we get a wound so that, you know, it doesn't keep bleeding out. And we also don't want pathogens to get in there. So trees will wound over so that they don't get any pathogens into that tap hole once it gets into the growing season. In the springtime, that's not so much of an issue, but once the leaves come out, we don't want pathogens to get into there. So they create a little wound. That's the width of that hole that we drill. And it goes in about 2 inches. And then, but it'll go up and down above and below these holes. So each year we're going to shift over. So I'm going to drill and put a new tap in. So I've got this new spout. I put a brand new spout onto this tubing system already. So we use a brand new, so it's clean. If we use old ones, that it'd have microbes on it, and that would get into the tap hole, and that would grow inside there, and it would plug up all the cells of the wood that the sap is flowing through. So we want to use a new clean one each year. And then I'm just using my drill. You can see my drill bit, and I've got this little spacer here that allows me, that's the depth I'm going to go in, about 1.5 inches into the tree. And when I'm looking, I'm going to make sure that there's no scars because I need to get into new clean wood. I can't get into where there's any other scars because I won't get any sap. As I already mentioned, we want to make sure that the canopy is healthy. I can't tap where I tapped previously. So I'm usually going to shift over about 1 to 2 inches and then either going to come up or down from my old tap hole. So I'm trying to follow this pattern. And as I shift over, I want to have, this looks like a good spot. I want to have good solid footing. You can see the shavings coming out of there, and they're a nice light colored shavings, which is good. That means that that's good healthy wood. If they were darker tan colored, that wouldn't be a healthy wood where we would get sap from. That'd be an old wound. And then I bring this little pick with me that I get all the shavings to come out of the tree so that those don't get clogged up in the tubing system. And then the last thing I got to do is just gently squeeze a hammer and tap this into the tree. So as we can see here, we've got the tubing connected to that spout. The sap will flow down out of here and will come into this tubing line and will flow downhill. So we have all of this tubing set up so that through gravity, the weight of that sap will pull that sap downhill towards our collection tanks. But as we'll see when we get down to our sap house, that we actually have a pump on there. So we put a vacuum pump on it, kind of like the pump on a vacuum cleaner that creates a suction, and we're helping pull that sap through the line. But what it's also doing is creating a greater pressure difference, so more sap will flow out of the tree and come down into our sap house. So we'll see those pumps when we get a little bit farther down there. as
Mr.
we
Wild,
could-
we had a question about this piece. Somebody wanted to know, why is the line straight and not tipped or pointed at a slope?
So it might be a little deceptive, but it does have a slight slope to it. Sometimes with the topography of the land, it kind of plays tricks on our eyes so that it looks like it's not sloping, but it is actually sloping. So we try to maintain a 2% slope or more with our tubing systems. And so we do put a level on it to make sure that we maintain that pitch with all of the tubing.
Another question is, what is the value of tapping the same tree year after year?
So the value is, I mean, we want to maximize and use all the trees that we can in our property to get the best, the best production that we can. And so if we're tapping different trees every year, then we're missing out on production. But the trees if they're healthy and they're growing, we're going to continue to they'll heal over, and we'll have new wood to tap into every year. So we want to, make sure that we can keep getting from those trees year after year, so we can get higher yields from our land, so we can actually be able to make a profit off that land for the investment. Because if we're running out all of this tubing system, that costs money to have, and so we want to make sure that we can get the investment back from that by being able to get sap from those trees year after year.
So how do you know if you're getting a good amount or quality of sap from a certain tree? Do you not really know?
So we have some research that we do where we monitor trees on we have different experimental trials of using different types of tubing, different types of spouts, that we can then see how that's working out on those individual trees using that treatment, where we do monitor on an individual basis. And then we can look at that and apply that to all of our trees, but we're also walking to a lot of our trees throughout the woods, and we're actually watching them and making sure sap is flowing from them. We can get leaks in our tubing system. A big issue is squirrels that chew little holes in the tubing, and that causes leaks in our vacuum system. So we're not getting high yields. So we do spend a lot of times in our woods when the sap is flowing to make sure that we're getting good production from those trees. As we see here, we're coming so tubing that's actually coming over top of our road, that's coming from our trees, and then it's actually connecting down into these larger tubings. This is our larger, what we call our main line. So it came to the laterals from the trees into these big main lines that will continue flowing down into Sap House. So we have the huge tubing where we probably have close to 100 miles of tubing all throughout our woods that's collecting from that 6,500 trees that are all flowing down into one collection point. So yeah, as I was saying about some of the research that, we have different experimental work where we're looking at different sizes of tubings that'll help with yield. Some of that will allow us to create vacuum on that sap by just using the weight of the sap dropping over, kind of dropping down a hill. We also look at different types of spouts, look at whether we're using clean spouts or dirty spouts. We look at when we tap the trees, because if that tap hole is open for a longer period of time, then there's more chance of microbes getting in there and growing and plugging up the cells of the wood, so sap flow does not come out of the trees in high abundance, especially later in the season. We've had some trees that we actually tapped back in October. And so in October and November, early December, when we had some freezing and thawing temperatures, we were able to collect some sap and see if we can continue to get sap from those trees into the spring without harming the growth of those trees. So we want to make sure that we can do that in a sustainable way that's healthy for the trees. We're also looking at doing some nutrient studies within our trees, where we add in different nutrients that the trees need to see if that increases their health. We're also looking at doing some experiments where we're removing some competing trees that are not as healthy from around our trees that we are tapping, so that those trees have room to grow and their canopies can expand, because those sugars that we're collecting are being made through photosynthesis during the growing season. So each of our little leaves on a tree is like its own little factory that is producing all of that, those sugars, and the trees are then storing those. So if we have more leaves on our trees, more individual little factories producing sugars through photosynthesis during the growing season, we're usually going to have more sugars in the trees, so we can gain more production from the trees overall.
So Mr. Best, if you, or
So
I'm sorry,
maybe down here.
Mr. Wild, if you could, a lot of we are getting a lot of questions in. Could you just give us some idea about time frames? How long does it take you to tap for the maple season? And then how long does it take for sap to be made into syrup? And I know we're getting into understanding how the sap that you tapped from the tree is going to be made into maple syrup. But could you give some timelines as to what that looks like? How long does it take?
Yep. Yeah, so for us, we can tap around 120 to 150 trees a day per person. And right now we have a lot of those, usually on snowshoes. It's a lot slower going in our woods. Some regions they not get as much snow. You can tap trees a lot faster because you can move the woods a lot quicker. Sometimes it depends on the amount of squirrel damage you have to fix while you're up.
I'm so
traditionally
sorry.
to tap our
I'm so sorry. Just going to pause you. You're breaking up quite a bit. Mr. Best, could you maybe maybe move us to a different location?
Can you hear me okay right now?
Yes, much better. Thank you. Oh, and I think we lost you.
Take us about 3 to 4 weeks to tap all of our trees in our woods. Some producers who have even more taps than we do may start in early January to get all those taps into the trees. And then from the standpoint of from the tree to the actual time that we have finished syrup, within a day, takes about roughly maybe 8 hours for that sap to flow through the lines down into our sap house, and then to process that into syrup. But it depends. There is a lot of variables into there as well. But mostly I usually say around 8 to 10 hours. But there's sap continuously flowing. So whenever sap's flowing, we're always producing that. So it's hard to keep track exactly how long, but we have to process our sap as quickly as possible, or it can actually spoil, because there are sugars and nutrients and different microbes like to feed on that. So it's important that we process it as quickly as possible. So if it takes more than if it sits for more than a day, it can actually spoil.
Great.
All right, are you hearing us okay?
We're hearing you okay. We actually don't have video at the moment, but we can still ask some of the questions. So I think there might be some confusion. So you tap the tree, that sap is being vacuumed from the tree, going down those big black lines that we saw, and then we're headed to a collection area. Is that right?
Correct. Yep. We're going to go to a collection tank, and hopefully we'll get to see those in a minute.
And that's still a raw product. I guess there's some confusion. That sap is a raw product. It's sap. It's not made into maple syrup yet.
Correct. Yep, that is still a raw product. So that's that liquidy sap that's only 2% sugar. We need to turn it into finished syrup, which is 66% syrup, sugar. And so to do that, as we'll see, we need to take that sap and we need to remove water. And the way we do that is by cooking it through so that water is evaporating off as steam, and it concentrates those sugars down and thickens it into the syrup that we know. Also, while it's cooking, that cooking process is actually caramelizing the sugars and is giving a lot of flavor into the maple syrup. So that raw sap, you can drink it. It's really good but it's mostly water with just a little bit of sugar. It's kind of like nature's Gatorade with a little bit of sugar and some electrolytes in it, but it's not something you want to put on your pancakes. It'll just make them really soggy without any flavor. So we need to concentrate the sugars down by cooking it through evaporation, and that gives it that caramel flavor to it. And so we'll see that process today as well, but it's definitely still a raw product when it's still sap.
Now, we still don't have video, but just to Oh, we are back on video, but just to follow up from that, now there are some people who are taking out some of the time and hard work, is that right, of using maple sap. They're taking that raw product and making it into things without using the energy to and time to boil it down into syrup. What are some products are you seeing that's just using the sap?
So there are some people who will bottle it straight into where people can drink it. The issue with that is you need to be able to pasteurize it so that it'll store for a longer period of time. As I mentioned before, it'll spoil. So it has to be pasteurized, which requires special equipment that is not is easy to come across for most maple producers. There are some maple producers who are selling that sap to folks who are using it for in the brewing process of beer and different kind of fermentation products as well. And you can cook with it. That doesn't happen as much, but you can make, maple, use it to cook pasta in, or use it for making coffee instead of water. Anything that you can substitute water in any type of product.
Excellent. Well, we are really excited to have video back. It's a little grainy, but we can move on to our next step in our agenda.
All right, so we're down here at the Sap House. So this is where all of that liquidy, runny sap is going to be coming down. So if we look, you can see back behind the building, you can see all the blue and black large tubing lines. Those are all coming down from our woods from 6,000 trees. We're probably tapping about 150 acres of land. So that's all that's coming down. And I like to think of those tubing systems as kind of like, think of that like a big river, and then rivers branch off into smaller rivers and then tributaries. That's what our tubing system does, is it fans out throughout our woods, but everything's funnelling down. This is our main collection point down here. I'll just point out in the corner of the building close to us, there's this little box here. That's actually a sensor system, and that's connected throughout our woods, where we have these little sensors that are connected to the tubing systems at the ends of them, where it's measuring the temperature out there in our woods. So we can see what the temperature is in different sections. There goes our crew coming out of the woods for lunch break. They were out tapping, so they're coming in to have a little lunch break. So these sensors, they measure the temperature, but they're also measuring the vacuum in the line. So if there's a leak from like a squirrel chew, I can pinpoint that to a little section. Instead of having to walk 100 miles of tubing system throughout the woods, I can maybe get it down to a smaller 1 mile section. So that's a handy little instrument that is a kind of modern piece into maple syrup production that we have nowadays. All right, so we're gonna come into the Sap House here. So this is inside our Sap Collection House. Can you guys see the video okay?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. We'll see it in the corner, not the most exciting. It's the suction within the lines that helps bring that sap down into our collection tanks a lot faster, and also allows us to get more sap from the trees. As we come inside here, this is our what we call our releaser room. So all of the sap is coming into the buildings on this back wall right below this metal rail. You can see the different lines that are coming in. I'll take this lid off. All the sap is going to drop down into here. And I like to think of this, because we're under a vacuum. This is like the dust collection cup in a vacuum cleaner, that the sap drops down into here, and then it pulls the air and it sucks the air out, so it separates the air for the vacuum. Once that fills up, that little barrel, there's a float that'll go up, and it turns the pump on that'll pump all of our sap out of this room and over into our tanks that we're going to see in just a minute. One other thing I'm going to point out here, we also have filters. This is a cloth filter that goes down into this canister, so we can pass our sap through there, and it's going to filter out any debris or anything that's gotten into our sap and cleans the sap up. These individual units here, which we call a canister, is actually used for our research purposes, where we can collect certain volumes of sap, and I can measure that volume, measure the percent sugar, and then record how much sap I'm getting from individual trees. So let's go ahead and look at the sap collection tanks real quick. We're going to see where all of the sap drops into. We have these two large stainless steel collection tanks. They each hold about 3,000 gallons of maple sap. So when sap's flowing, these will fill up. We'll fill both of these big tanks. We can have over 6,000 gallons of sap or more a day, because in a good sap flow day from one tree, you can easily get 1 to 2 gallons of sap from an individual tree. But when as we talked about just a little bit ago, as we are concentrating that sap, as we're cooking it and boiling it down and evaporating off the water, we're concentrating the sugar, we're removing water, we're going to end up with less of a product. So the ratio of sap to syrup is about 40 to 1. So it takes about 40 gallons of maple sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. So even though those tanks are big and each one has 3,000 gallons of sap it's going to hold, it's really only going to turn into like 80 gallons of finished maple syrup. So it's a lot of sap for a little bit of a finished product.
So Mr. Wild, as we're transitioning over, there are some questions, a lot of questions coming in. Are maple trees the only kind of trees that you can tap?
No, so you can tap any maple tree, but there are other syrups. So you can tap beech trees and make beech syrup. I'm experimenting with that a little bit. You can tap birch trees and make birch syrup. We actually tap about 500 birch trees here and make birch syrup. It's a different season. It's after the maples, when it's a little bit warmer, that we actually will make birch sap. You can tap sycamores, you can tap walnuts, you can tap basswood trees. So there's definitely other trees that you can tap.
So along that line,
so
before we get too deep into, we don't want to get too deep into the other types of trees we can tap, but with compared to a maple tree and a birch tree, what's the percent of the sugar content that comes out of each of those? You said 2% for maple trees. What's a sugar content of birch sap?
Birch are usually about 1% or even less. So it's really low. That makes a big difference in our production. So as I said, maple are a ratio of about 40 to 1. In birch, it's like a ratio of about 100 to 1 of sap to finished syrup. So that makes a big difference. Any other questions before we start talking about our? All right, so we're
let's take
across.
A look at this.
We're over in the sugar house now. So this is where we actually take our sap and finish it off into maple syrup. So this is where the fun kind of the finished product is actually happening. So in our sugar house here, what we're seeing right now is actually what's called the evaporator, because it is evaporating water off of the maple syrup or off the maple sap and cooking that into finished maple syrup. So the sap's going to be coming into here, but if you imagine making maple sap is like taking a pot of water, filling it all the way to the very top, put it on your stove and try to boil that so that it creates a boil and then evaporates down so you have like a half an inch of water on the bottom. That's what we do to make maple syrup. It's very time consuming to actually do that, to cook it down and boil it off. So evaporation is not the most efficient process for removing water from syrup. So we actually have 2 stages that we do with maple syrup a lot of times now. Not every maple producer does this, but a lot of commercial maple producers will now use what's called reverse osmosis. And reverse osmosis is used in a lot of water purification applications. It was actually developed by the Navy for creating clean drinking water from the ocean by removing the salt and impurity. So in maple, though, we want to remove pure water and leave behind the impurities, which are the sugars and the minerals that we actually want in our finished maple syrup. So we use the reverse osmosis machine. So right now we're inside our reverse osmosis room, and so these have these individual, if you look at these big stainless steel kind of towers that are here, these each have a membrane or a filter there, and there's pumps that push the sap up against it, and the molecules of water are smaller than sugar molecules or any mineral molecules. So the water pushes through and gets filtered out, and it leaves behind some of the water, but also leaves behind those sugars and minerals. So we've removed a lot of that purified water, which we do use for cleaning the machines at the end of the day. So it does get used before it gets dumped, but we get to concentrate those sugars. So all of our sap is first coming into here to these reverse osmosis machines where we'll concentrate it. And then it sends that concentrated sap up to the loft area where we have some tanks. And then from there, it'll flow down into this evaporator. This evaporator send a huge flame underneath of here. And then the sap is going to be traveling into, there's this hood up here, there's little pipes that'll first travel through because there's going to be lots of steam coming up that'll preheat that sap and make it warm. It'll drop down into this big back pan, which has lots of little ridges inside of it. So it has really high surface area so that it's not one big giant pan, it's a bunch of little narrow individual pans. And then we'll come into the front pans where it spreads out a little bit more, and there's all these dividers in here. This is where a lot of the flavoring comes into the caramelizing of those sugars as it travels, snakes through this pathways and is heating. That last bit of evaporation is happening, but it's caramelizing all those sugars. So it gets to the very front portion. This is where the finished maple syrup is going to be drawn off into this barrel here. And maple syrup is going to finish, as I mentioned, 66% sugar or at 7 degrees above the boiling point of water. But our boiling point is going to change based on our elevation and what the pressure is in the atmosphere of that day. We're at a higher elevation. We're at about 2,000 feet in elevation here. So our boiling point will be lower than it is in a lot of other regions. But we're constantly measuring with both a hydrometer, a flow measurement, and then we're also measuring with temperature as well. So all of our maple syrup, once we have, once we've boiled it, we usually store it right into big stainless steel barrels because it stores the best, and we don't have time. We'll be producing about 50 gallons of maple syrup in an hour from that evaporator. We don't have time to fill little bottles. So we'll store it into big barrels for the time being. And then when we're ready to finish off the maple unit, over here, the canning unit, are larger barrels of maple syrup. So we'll take from one of these. This is a big 40-gallon barrel. We'll fill it up into our canner. We can heat it back up to 180 degrees. And as long as we get it above 180 degrees, that's a sterilization point that'll kill any bacteria or microbes off, where we can then fill into individual bottles when we need them. It depends on the size of bottles that we need overall.
Well, we have a few questions. It's also interesting. So we've gone from the sugar bush to the collection tank to evaporating it down into maple syrup, and now we're bottling that maple syrup. So a couple questions. We're at just about at the end of our time, so I'm going to popcorn some questions that have come in. It might come from any one of these sections that we talked about. One question is, are you only using the trees that were there in the forest, or have you planted maple trees to be able to increase your sap available to you?
Everything that we're tapping are trees that are ones that were natively grown throughout our forest. So it's actually more efficient and better to use trees that have already been, will naturally regenerate on their own. We do have some plantations where we do some experimenting with trees that were planted, but it's usually better and cheaper to maintain natural regeneration and tap trees that are there naturally. Here's a cross section from a tree where we can see some of where the tree was actually drilled from where that tree was. So the tree, when it was tapped, was this wide. Now it's grown out over top of that and healed over on the tree. and then it's creating that scar up and down below the tree. So this darker region is the area of dead wood. That's the kind of that scabbed over area that I talked about, that I can never tap into that region. And that's why each year I need to shift over so that I'm not tapping into that same scarred over wood.
And they want to know, how much maple syrup did you produce last year and how do you distribute it for sale?
So last year we made almost 3,000 gallons of maple syrup from about, we actually have somebody bring some sap to us from about 1,000 trees. So we had about 6,500, almost 7,000 trees we were boiling from, actually almost 7,000 trees last year. So we made about 0.42 gallons per tap, I think, on average last year. Our sales, we sell retail to people who stop by our sugar house. We have actually a little box right here with all of our different products that folks can stop by and pick up maple syrup. We get a lot of tourists to the Lake Placid regions. We're up in the mountains. There's lots of lakes, so lots of visitors come to this area. So we sell our syrup there. But a majority of it, we actually sell to a restaurant down in the Washington, D.C. area that's got a few different branches. So we actually wholesale a lot of maple syrup that they use within their restaurant as well.
Very interesting. And we are going to just finish off today and our time together with one final question. So our final question is, you mentioned that you could tap any maple tree, and somebody says, does that include Japanese maples?
In theory, yes. I wouldn't recommend it because they're very slow growing trees. So it's going to take them a long time to heal over. And remember, you also usually want a tree that's, at least 8 to 10 inches in diameter. Not that you can't tap a tree when it's smaller, but that wound makes more of a difference as the percentage of wood to the total volume that's there. And so Japanese maple trees usually don't get as big and they grow really slowly. So you're probably not going to get a lot of sap from them, but in theory, you can tap them.
Well,
I've never done it, and I've never.
Well, Mr. Weil, we cannot thank you enough for your time today. You gave us so much information and such a wonderful presentation. Thank you for inviting us into Uihlein, and we are going to send this link of this recording out to all of the teachers who registered, and we can't wait to visit you again.
All right, thanks for stopping by, everybody. If you're ever in the Lake Placid area with your family, feel free to stop by for a tour again.
Thanks everyone
you.
for joining us.